Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. This is episode 15. In this episode, we've got a very special guest, Dr. Cody Havard from the University of Memphis. He's really the expert in sports and sports rivalry, and we talk about that and other things. It was an interview we thought was going to be about 25 minutes. It ended up being over an hour, so we're really excited about that. It's a great interview. So without further ado, because like I said, it went pretty long, I'll send you over there now.
There we go.
Thanks.
So in the marketing classes, when we talk about branding, we'll talk about, I always have 4 examples, and one of them is like Danica Patrick. One of them is Ron Artest, Meta World Peace. But one of them is Lance Armstrong, and the other is Michael Phelps. And we kind of get into this discussion over, Danica Patrick and the way that she was promoted compared to the way male athletes are promoted, and kind of the over sexualization of female athletes in society. Then when we talk about Meta World Peace, we talk about the he's a person who is an example of trying to change your brand, trying to rebrand. I mean, he literally changed his name. And I don't think anybody really kind of followed that as much. But then we talk about, you look at Michael Phelps and what happened with Michael Phelps and winning the gold medals and winning the championships. And then when he had his, he had the I forget what year it was that he had the picture come out with him at a party smoking marijuana. And we kind of talk about what impact that had, and especially with kind of younger audience. And then we contrast that with Lance Armstrong, and we sort of get into a conversation. And this is, I think, the further we get away from it, fewer and fewer students really know what was happening. But, sometimes we'll get into a really good conversation about his means to an end. So he cheated. He did things that were against the rules in sport, and that are, kind of go against the fundamental rules of sport, if you will. And in addition to that, the real issues that I have are that he, when people would challenge him, he would do whatever he had to do to keep that story silent.
Like aggression.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, there's so many stories of people who he literally did like destroy careers because of that, they had the audacity to speak out against him. And that is beyond kind of repair. On the sports side, there's also, we talk about, he started Live Strong, or he was the spokesperson for Live Strong. He made the sport of cycling popular in the United States. He made the tour popular. He was fundamental in starting a professional tour in the United States. And kind of what's, the good and bad that comes with that. And occasionally, as I said, the further we get away from it, students, I think, know less and less about it because it's not contemporary anymore. But occasionally we'll get into some good conversation about it and really kind of break into that. If someone who's doing something really, really good does things that are also not good or bad in his instance, what's the trade-off,
Sure. Yeah. And one thing I know he's talked about that a lot of people don't think about is the momentum of the story. When he came back from cancer and every team shunned him, he was signed with Confidis, this French team. They backed out of their contract literally while he's in the hospital bed. And he said he kind of came back with this attitude of like, all right, there's one team. There's the team that took me, and everybody else is an enemy. And then they come in, and him and Johan, he wins that first tour in '99, and then he's got this story. He's got the win. and immediately starts getting questioned, because of what had happened in 1998 with all the doping that got exposed, basically. And it's sort of like, what's he to do? I mean, and I think, as you said, and I totally agree, the way he handled it going forward, especially once he really had the power, is pretty bad.
Yeah.
And it's not admirable at all. But I do think it's interesting that first year or two, it's like, what's he going to do at that point? Say, yes, I dope, we all dope. And, then, like you said, it's 50, 75 people, employees on his team lose their job, the sponsors go away. And, so it's an interesting kind of situation that, that he was in to some degree.
Well, and it is an interesting kind of case study for students to talk about that.
So you were kind of talking about when sometimes it goes too far, or athletes go too far, and, maybe that then there's components of what they've done that turn off maybe even their fans. And
and I think that, even out of sport, it is a good kind of case study to tell someone like, look, and again, I don't know what the intentions were. But when something starts happening and you have that realization, you have that point where you realize you should change course, or I guess you could, it's the path and the fork in the road, right? You could change course and you could do something else, or you keep going down this path. And I think it's like this is a big example of what happens when people keep going down that path. Because you had mentioned earlier, like that competitive advantage or that competitive edge, and the actual athletic competition, and also kind of that edge away from the athletic competition where, it's like didn't want anyone to kind of stand in his way or anything. So it's just an interesting case study to talk to students about that. I think as I said, the further we get away from it, the less relevant it becomes, because, fewer and fewer people know kind of the ins and outs of it, because we're now more than 10 years removed from all of that, almost 15 years removed from it.
Well, that's kind of a little bit of a segue. Talking about like things where, it kind of gets out of hand and you maybe take what's in between the lines out of the lines. I was watching one of your lectures from the University of Nebraska speech that you gave, and you were kind of discussing some of the, everybody knows the positives of like rivalries and all of that kind of stuff, but there can be some negatives. And sometimes there's, an increased kind of propensity to maybe get in a fight, or maybe, among fans and that kind of stuff. And that can have, large negative consequences, kind of like we're talking about with Lance, where you've got his kind of take no prisoners, you have no friends. I mean, there's many stories where he would find young riders at the back of the peloton and they'd be talking to another team rider and he'd be like, no, this is war. You got to go to the front. So there's a level of fans that like that and sort of follow along in that way. But then when he sues somebody who has no net worth compared to him, even those fans don't want to see that, and it can kind of turn them away. And one of the things I know that you mentioned is sort of that if you go to an event and you're, especially if you're a young impressionable person and you see a fight break out, you may never go back to that team or even that sport to some degree. Could you expand on that a little bit? Or
yeah, and so what we have done, and I guess, I mean, it's almost 10 years now. It's over 10 years now. Really, I started looking at rivalry in 2009 because, or I guess the end of 2008. The 2008 college football season, I was living in Colorado. I had just moved there. And that was when Texas football, my alma mater, was really, really good. And they played Oklahoma, and I think it was number maybe 1 and 2 in the country. Texas beats Oklahoma on the field, and then later in the season loses to Texas Tech. A lot of people remember Michael Crabtree's catch with 1 second remaining. And then the next week or 2 weeks later, Oklahoma plays Texas Tech, and they beat Texas Tech. So at the end of that season, it was a 3-way tie for who was going to represent the Big 12 South in the Big 12 championship. And it was Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas Tech. And in those days, it had to, well, in those days there were 12 teams, but in those days, they actually went to the 5th or 6th tiebreaker to see who was going to represent the Big 12 South. And it ended up being BCS points, BCS rating or rankings. And Oklahoma beat Texas out by something like 0.04 of a point or 0.1 of a point or so. It was really, really close. And Oklahoma goes on. They play in the Big 12 championship. They win the Big 12 championship. They go on and they play Florida in the national championship. And I remember watching that Florida-Oklahoma game and thinking, I really want Florida to win. And really the only ties I have to the state of Florida is I am a huge fan of Walt Disney World, which I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit. So I'm sitting there watching this game and I'm like, I want Florida to win, but I don't care if they win anymore the next year. I don't care if they win a game the next year. And then it dawned on me that, it's not that I want Florida to win. I don't want Oklahoma to have the success that I thought maybe Texas should have. And by extension, the success that I should have had. And so I started thinking, if I'm feeling this way, other people have to be feeling this way. Hopefully other people are feeling this way. I'm not alone in this. And so that's what set me on the path of, I started interviewing people and getting into looking at things like schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the demise of someone else, comparison and competition, how we're constantly trying to compare ourselves to someone else. We compare ourselves to make sense of the world, or we put ourselves in groups to make sense of the world. And those are in groups and out groups. An in group is a collection of people who agree with a particular viewpoint or support a particular team, like we have, like we support. An out group is everyone else. And there can be various in groups and out groups that exist on various levels. So if you are, we'll take the Texas-Oklahoma example. Me as a Texas fan, I was in the Texas in group. Oklahoma was an out group. However, if you look at Big 12 versus SEC or Big 10 or something like that, you can have that as an in group as well. Now you look at Memphis Athletics as the in group, but if the AAC, because usually someone from the AAC is playing in a what they call now, the New Year's Six Bowl. Yeah. That you kind of cheer for them because that looks good on your conference, and therefore it looks good on your favorite team, and by extension, it looks good on you. So a few years ago, I was really happy when UCF did what they did. That 2-year run that they went on, and especially, that 2-year run, they were playing Memphis in the AAC championship, and they were, 1 year went to double overtime, I think. And so we have all these in groups and out groups, and we compare against others that we see as competitors or rivals, and to make us look better or make us feel better. One way to feel better or to compare favorably is obviously if we have some type of direct competitive advantage over them. So if our favorite team beats another favorite team, then through vicarious experience, we are vicariously successful. But also, if we lose, people still have to find a way to make themselves feel better. So they may revert to, that's where you see like, oh, the other team was cheating, or they, the refs were against us. Everyone was against us. It was us against the world. And it's all ways to just control for our egos.
Well, it's like when you said when the experiment was run where people were shown a player that was a Division II player, but was told they were going to be a commit, and if the viewers viewed that they were a commit to their school, they're like, oh, this guy's going to be great, and if they viewed that he was a commit to the rival, they're like, well, he's not that good.
Yeah,
and, I mean, it's
the same exact video.
Yeah,
right? It's the same exact footage. And that was actually that was Daniel Wan who did that. He led that team of researchers, and he's the first person to develop a scale to measure fan behavior, or I'm sorry, fan identification. And he actually, when I was working on my doctorate, that article was the one that I had to evaluate and kind of critique, if you will, in one of my comprehensive exams. And I read that and was just floored that, yeah, you look at the different evaluations people have, and it exists in sport and out of sport. So I when it initially started and I was talking to people about sport rivalry, then, the whole time, this idea of, I'm really interested in why group membership matters. And I'm interested in why someone who is in one group feels a certain way towards someone who's in another group. And why is that more negative? And that's in sport and out of sport. Why do people who believe something different politically, why do they view each other differently? Why do people of different skin tones and skin colors or view each other differently from different ethnic groups? And it's just always been really interesting to me. And so through those interviews, I had identified glory out of reflective failure, which was how it explains people's satisfaction they get from seeing their rival lose to someone else. So it explained why I was excited when the University of Florida won that championship. Again, having no ties to the university, my only tie to the state being Walt Disney World. And then I also, as part of the dissertation, no one had developed and validated a scale to measure how sport fans and how group members perceived other group members or other groups. And so we developed the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale, which it's 12 items, and it asks people their willingness to support a rival when they're playing someone else, their perceptions of the behavior of their rival supporters, the perceptions of the prestige of the rival supporters, and if that's college, it's academic prestige. If it's professional, it's prestige of the city or a region. Because believe it or not, I had people tell me they knew nothing about graduate programs at their rival schools, but they wouldn't go get a master's degree at their rival institution because they knew nothing about the academics, but it couldn't be as good as the school they were at. And then the last one is how much satisfaction someone gets from that direct competition. If your favorite team is successful in the direct competition. So that kind of set us down the path of looking into how group behavior was different. And sport is a really, really good setting because that allows people to have direct competition and allows fans to experience that vicarious success and, vicarious failure as well. And then since then, we've been able to take it on to now we're looking at comparing in-group behavior or group behavior and group deviance in sport with things out of sport as well.
Yeah, I mean, the rivalry is a huge thing. I remember when Memphis was really, I think it was the first year with Coach Fuente in football that we were really good. And I remember Ole Miss had just beaten Alabama, and that they had all these, recruits coming in and stuff. And I remember one of my friends said to me, he's like, if we just beat Ole Miss and lose every other game, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what we did.
Yeah.
We entered the game undefeated. We beat Ole Miss, stormed the field, and then lost like 3 conference games after that. And everybody was happy because we made a bowl and we beat that, perceived rival at that time. Another thing that's kind of crazy that fits in perfectly with all this stuff you're doing is like the conference realignment. Memphis obviously was one of the people kind of right in the crosshairs. We joined the Big East, and the Big East disappeared, and then the AAC was formed. But kind of talking about the rivalries and the difference between a rivalry game and a non-rivalry game, and kind of like the revenue and things like that come from it. One of the driving factors, if not basically the driving factor for the conference realignment, was the money, the TV dollars, how it was, and jump in if you disagree, but kind of the TV dollars and the way that was distributed, especially for Nebraska going from Big 12 to Big 10. But in doing that, you take this increase in dollars, but you move away from your traditional rivals. And one of the things I know you mentioned in that lecture was these teams that move to these new conferences, all of a sudden when people were pulled from those schools, they named 3 times the number of rivals, which is obviously a much weaker kind of thing. And there's maybe some monetization lost in rivalry games, or that kind of stuff. But what do you think about that? Or
and we had started looking at 2011. 2011 is when kind of the latest rendition of conference realignment reared its ugly head. And so we had started looking at that and started talking to people. And at that time I was in Colorado. So we were talking to people from Colorado and people from Nebraska. My wife is from Lincoln, Nebraska. A lot of her family still lives in that area. So they're big Cornhuskers fans. And so I was looking at talking to people about the loss of this rival. And so we had talked to people from Nebraska, Colorado, Texas A&M, because Texas A&M was leaving. We were talking to people from Missouri, Kansas, and they were talking about in Syracuse and all of these kind of bigger known and some lesser known rivalries. And what we saw was that there was this inherent need for comparison. And so when a team felt they were losing their rival, either because they were moving to a new conference or they were staying in a conference and their rival was moving, they needed to find other teams to compare against. And that's where we started doing some quantitative analysis and looking at, pre-conference realignment, before the teams actually left, how did fans of Texas A&M feel toward the Texas Longhorns? And they identified the LSU Tigers as the rival in the SEC. How did they feel toward them? Kansas, Arkansas fans, how did they feel toward Kansas, and how did they feel toward Missouri fans, how did they feel toward Kansas and Arkansas? Sorry. And we found that at that time, people were more negative toward the current rival because they had this history with them than they were the new rival. The new rival was there to, kind of take the place. We also, 3 seasons later, we recollected some data and we found that on-field comparisons, people were still more negative regarding the former rival than they were the current rival. Those off-field, so if they were a Texas A&M fan, for example, was less likely to support the Longhorns when they played someone else. They got more satisfaction when the Texas A&M would beat Texas or compare favorably to them in some way. However, those off-field characteristics, such as prestige of the rival and fan behavior, they were more negative toward the current rival, because that was like their contemporary analysis or comparison right now. And so from that is where we got all of that information about how many teams identified your team as a rival, how many different teams were identified as a rival of your team. And kind of the key takeaway from all of that. And we did that for practitioners to show, like Texas had 11 different schools that identified them as a rival. So if we're looking at brand preference or brand equity, that would suggest that Texas has very strong brand equity because there's 11 different brands who are trying to compare themselves to you. At the same time, it was Syracuse had, I think, 11 different teams they identified. Nebraska had 5 or 6. And it was all of these teams that had moved conferences. Some people were identifying rivals in the new conference, trying to kind of get that going. And others were still, with the old conference. And so the key takeaway for practitioners was you can't expect to join a new conference and this just immediately take over. And I think we've seen that with a lot of the teams that have joined new conferences. I mean, West Virginia, who really is their rival in the Big 12. I think Nebraska, the Big 10 being the quote unquote rival conference, they did a really good job at identifying, okay, at the end of the year, Iowa and Nebraska are going to play and they're going to be rivals. And so the two administrations got together and they created the Heroes Trophy to try to put a positive spin on it. They highlighted citizens from each state who could be voted upon and were the heroes for that year. Then they started the administrations of Nebraska and Wisconsin started developing a rivalry to play for the Freedom Cup. The Freedom Trophy, where they paid homage to military. And in those instances, those two groups, Iowa and Nebraska, Wisconsin and Nebraska, they are comparing against each other. So they are rivals. They're in competition. But, for the period of time that they talk about the military or they talk about the heroes from each state, most people can, it creates one large in group at that moment for the 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes that they're talking about that, whatever. The other side of that is when you look at Minnesota and Nebraska, and that rivalry is actually called the $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy. And I won't go through all of it here, but it basically started because of a Twitter battle between the mascot account at Minnesota and the Bo Pelini account at the University of Nebraska when Bo Pelini was still the coach. And it kind of went back and forth about what they were going to compete over. And it was suggested, hey, if we win, the winner gets $5. The other person says the winner gets to break a chair over the other person's head. And the response was, as long as, we get to make a trophy out of it. And there it is. There's actually a trophy that is a broken chair with $5 like glued to the bottom. And they made a trophy of it. They've passed it around after games. There was a period of time where the administrations, I think 2 years where they didn't do it because of the negative connotation associated with it. And then the fans who developed the trophy kind of went back and they started raising funds and put a more positive spin on it. So the two universities worked together to raise funds for different charities and local charities. But it's the interesting thing is it begged the question. We had 2 examples where administrations tried to do something positive and they create this positive relationship. And did fans really identify with that? I don't know. It's hard to tell. Minnesota or Wisconsin and Nebraska hasn't been a balanced rivalry or a balanced competition so far. So once Nebraska wins a few games, maybe it will grow in intensity. However, Minnesota and Nebraska, I mean, makes national news because of that trophy. And so it's like, this was organically created and grown by the fans, and they kind of went this negative route, which brings us to one more example of using Memphis. Because Memphis was new in the AAC, we had used Memphis, and I was working with someone at Western Kentucky, so we used Western Kentucky as an example as well. And we first asked students at Memphis to identify who they thought the rival was going to be in the next 2 years, and they said Cincinnati. Western Kentucky said Middle Tennessee State. We wanted to investigate how different promotional titles and logos influence fan behavior. And so we identified a positive logo, which was for Memphis. It was the red and blue friendly. There was a neutral one. So we had red and blue rivalry, and we had the team's logos on the shared logo, the rivalry logo. And then there was a negative one that was for Memphis and Cincinnati, 481 miles of hate. For Middle Tennessee State, Western Kentucky, it was 98 miles of hate. And so we had people exposed to each different, or we had 3 different groups exposed to different promotions and different logos. And we found that the people who viewed the negative title, so that one that had hate in it, they were more negative regarding the rival fan behavior. However, they actually were more or less negative regarding their willingness to support the rival. Whereas someone who viewed the neutral title, so it actually had the word rivalry in the title, they were less negative toward the fan behavior, but they were less likely to support the rival team in indirect competition. So, we were able to say, using negative titles potentially causes more group negativity, and actually may take away from the purpose of the rivalry. If we're looking at kind of building this interest, it actually could hurt the promotional aspects of the rivalry. However, you still have, teams that are using negative terms all of the time. And we did during that time see on Wikipedia that people at Western Kentucky and Middle Tennessee State started referring to that rivalry as 100 miles of hate. So I don't know if we had anything to do with that. I definitely don't want to take credit for it, because that's really a negative title. But it was an interesting study, that the findings we had.
Oh yeah. Well, and one thing you touched on that I think is pretty fascinating as well is you mentioned Texas having 11 different schools that named them as a rival or a chief rival, or was it a rival?
It was a rival. So usually it was chief rival, like number one rival, but it could have been number one or number two.
Okay. And that Texas was kind of ranked really high. They were the highest in the Big 12 or the highest in the country?
They were the highest in the country on what we collected. We didn't collect data from all teams.
Okay.
But they were the highest of the teams or the fan bases that we had collected.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then it's kind of a proxy for brand value.
Yeah.
Because you've got, more and more other teams that are going to, fill out the stadium or monetize those games in some way. And, for Texas, it could be 6, 7, 8 games on the calendar.
Yeah.
That way. Is that list do you have that list like published anywhere that people can see? Or
yeah, it's on our website, sportrivalry.com.
Okay.
And it's sport rivalry. A lot of people think it's sports rivalry that sends you somewhere else, I think.
Because that is a fascinating proxy for, that brand value.
Yeah. There's so when you go to the site, there's under the research tab, there's a section that says rivalry and NCAA athletics. And there is where you would see that information, like Syracuse identified 11 different teams. Texas was identified by 11 different teams. And then we had also taken the aggregate scores of the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale, and we compared those with fan groups, or we compared them between teams. And so we actually were able to, from our data, look at the most intense fan rivalries in NCAA athletics. And I'll let you see, who do you think was number one of the different teams? And I will say it's not a rivalry that a lot of people think about on a national level.
Yeah, because I would say something like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Oklahoma.
Yeah, so Texas, Oklahoma was number 5. Auburn, Alabama was 4. Missouri, Kansas was 3. Colorado, Nebraska was 2. I think because we had a lot of Colorado responses. Arizona, Arizona State is the most intense fan rivalry. And this is the...
is that just because they're so closely aligned, or they compete in recruiting and stuff, or across multiple sports, or anything like that?
It's that, they have... It's the state. So it's a intra-state rivalry. So there's that feeling of state supremacy. But, that's shared a lot of different places. Texas A&M, and they were number 13 on the list. Alabama, Auburn was number 4. What's really interesting about Arizona State, and this was actually the third time, or this is the third source that has come to the same conclusion regarding Arizona State from a fan perspective.
Wow.
And what's so interesting about Arizona State, and I didn't really know this until I talked to 2 people doing stories about the Arizona State rivalry and a book on it. There are a lot of people, those 2 schools get confused a lot on the national level. So you have fan bases that they're playing for, like, kind of that state supremacy and bragging rights, but at the same time, you have, like, even things like the NFL sent an award to the wrong school, like a player who played for, let's just say, Arizona State, and they sent it to Arizona. Like Major League Baseball has done that. Like a lot of, and they've had gaffes on television where people talk about the Arizona Sun Devils and the Arizona State Wildcats, and so it's this really interesting dynamic that these 2 groups of fans, like, they're competing over state supremacy, and so they are Group A and Group B. But then on a national level, it's almost like they are one group against, the state of Arizona, and those 2 fan bases are Group A, and everyone else is Group B, because they're getting them confused a lot. And that's been one of the more fascinating findings in sport. The sport aspect, or the sports setting, is like that rivalry and how those groups compare with each other.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. That confusion, you think about it from fan perspective, that'll get you going. I remember even when, I would talk to people about Memphis or the University of Memphis, and even when they would say, like, Memphis State, it's kind of like, it was Memphis State.
Yeah.
You get a little, riled up, because it's like you want that recognition where you're saying, hey, we've got this good basketball team, this good football team. Please try to get our name right.
Yeah.
And here, 2 fan bases are getting that confused. So is that something since this huge conference realignment happened, is that something you're kind of checking back in with to see, like, how, I know you mentioned that 3-year thing, because that's going to be kind of, 10 years down the road, there may be, major rivalries that we don't even, that weren't here 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so we basically, we want to check in every 3 or 4 years. So pre kind of pandemic, and just kind of how interesting and unique this season is and this year's going to be. I don't think we'll do it this year. I think we'll hold off another year. But yeah, we want to check back and see, basically, kind of collect new data, rerun the data, and compare that, because what would be really helpful for practitioners is to show, okay, after 3 years, here are these subtle differences. After 7 years, it would be, here's where it looks now. And or I guess so it would be 4 years. Here's how it looks now. Like maybe at that point, the new rival in the new conference, the current conference, they overtake the former rival in importance. And if that happens, and it happens, across fan bases, then we can tell practitioners, okay, here's how long you could expect for it to take.
How long it takes, yeah. How long
it's going to vary from school to school or group to group, but here's how long you have to think that it's going to take. And so, yeah, that is something we will check back on. We had planned to do it following this football season. I think because of just how unique everything is with this season, we're going to hold off on it another season, because I almost feel like this season you have 2 victories in a football game. The first victory is actually even playing the game. It's kind of like almost a surprise, like, oh, we get to play the game. And then the second one would be the outcome of the game, if you actually win the game or not,
Especially with rivalries, so much of what drives it is, the game day and people being there on the game day and getting together to watch it. And, with these empty stadiums or 10% capacity, that changes a big component of a rivalry game is that.
Yeah.
Whether it's hostile or somewhat friendly or whatever.
Yeah. And we'll see when the new normal sets in over the next year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, however long it is. We'll see, one, how comfortable people are getting back to live events. I'm part of a research team who's looking into that now, and we've looked at outside of sport, like how, for example, how Disney fans dealt with the parks being closed and things like that. It'll be interesting to see how people kind of get back into these entertainment settings, and then how those perceptions are different, or how their behavior toward out groups are different. I mean, you may think that kind of the positive aspect of this, or outlook on this, is this pandemic has kind of highlighted that, hey, we're all in this together, right? That could happen. It also could be you have fans from rival team A and fans from rival team B, and they just haven't seen each other enough. And so they get back together and it's more intense than ever. We don't really know what's going to happen, and it'll be really interesting to see what comes of it. Because, I could see either one happening. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think I hit everything that I kind of had jotted down. Is there anything else you want to throw in here or discuss?
Yeah, so I'll kind of say what we're doing now. And when I mean now, this is over the last probably 3 or 4 years. We really started looking at, early on, it dawned on me that I research kind of the negativity between groups, which kind of on a personal level or, individual level can be somewhat depressing. I've had people tell me some really depressing things about their rival teams. And so we started looking at how can we do something positive with this. And so with the help of graduate students, we developed a character named Sport Rivalry Man. And he's kind of the superhero. He's the superhero character. And we first developed him so we could tell stories about historical rivalries on sportrivalry.com. And then about 4 years ago, we started telling stories that they're called Adventures with Sport Rivalry Man, in which they put the protagonist in a situation where they have to make the decision on how they're going to treat an out-group member. So like we have a story on online bullying, are people going to bully someone because their favorite team wins or not? And are they going to help somebody change a flat tire? Are they going to they see their friend who cheers for another team, they drop their hat after a game, and do they make the decision to give it back? And we started looking at all of these examples that are seemingly simple examples that younger readers would understand, and focusing a lot of this toward like school age kids, and just some of the things that they are dealing with. And ultimately, through each story, Sport Rivalry Man kind of acts as the protagonist's conscience, and they make the right decision. Then we started looking at how kids interact with each other. Kids don't interact with other kids that would be considered out-group members, if you will. They don't interact negatively to those kids. Sure. Unless it's taught. Mm-hmm. And so then I had a graduate student 2 years ago who was getting her master's degree in educational counseling. And so she developed a curriculum around this. So now we have a curriculum that has been used with community youth and in schools that on how to teach kids and younger readers the appropriate ways to treat out-group members. And that's kids are really, really good at taking something from one context to another. Adults are it's more difficult because adults come with, their own biases and
a lot of programming,
yeah.
The kid, yeah.
Yeah. And so, if it's easier for a kid to say, hey, if I'm wearing one logo on my shirt of my favorite team and somebody else is wearing the logo of their favorite team, that doesn't mean I'm better than them or that we're that different. Hey, maybe that also means the kid who looks different from me isn't that different from me. I'm not better than that kid. They're not better than me. Like if they believe something different, that doesn't make us that different. And so that's kind of, the overarching goal is that maybe kids start to realize that. Maybe it starts to change their behavior a little bit, or make them think twice before saying something mean to someone. And the ultimate goal, wouldn't it be great if these kids became the teachers and they started telling their adult parents or like guardians how to treat out-group members. I mean, because kids learn things from adults, and repeatedly adults mess it up, right? So maybe it's time that, hey, maybe this is a situation where kids could teach the adults something. So we're doing that. And then we're also, as I said, we're comparing how group behavior relates in the sports setting and the non-sports setting. So we've compared how rival fans feel toward each other in sport, and we've compared that with how Disney fans feel toward Universal Parks, how fans of DC and Marvel Comics feel toward each other. We just collected data on how Republicans and Democrats feel toward each other. We're going to, look into things like religion, and we looked at esport gamers who use PlayStation versus Xbox, and we're going to do online versus console. So we're trying to compare anywhere where there can be a comparison of group A versus group B. We want to see where that kind of negativity lies, and can we determine if maybe group negativity is more prevalent in the sports setting than it is these consumer brands like theme parks, comic books, gaming. But is it more negative than in the political setting, which is actually there were two aspects of the rivalry scale where it was sport fans were more negative than political supporters, and two others where political supporters were more negative than sport fans. And if we could do that, the overall goal of that is just to better understand the human condition, if you will, that here are these different settings where this group comparison exists and where it's more negative in this setting than it is this other setting, and come up with, develop a type of hierarchy where here's where these differences can be expected, that type of thing. So that's kind of where we are now. We've I started this in 2009, and from where it started to where it is now, it feels really, really good to see where it is now and where it's going. Because now where it started in sport, and it started looking at promoting the sport product and then trying to help promote the sport product in a responsible way. So we could still have excitement around games, but not make anybody cross over the line and be deviant, because if they are, it ultimately hurts the fan experience, which ultimately hurts the organization. To where now, like, we're kind of taking this larger societal look at it as well. And so it's been a really, really fun journey from that aspect, seeing where all of these differences lie. And it's really nice finding some groups where, in some settings where the negativity is not as high as in sport, where people aren't saying some of the negative things they say in sport, that from an individual level, the personal level, that gives a large amount of hope, if you will.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology there. I mean, it's
a
lot of moving pieces, and there's always like so much you can learn from sport, and like you said, it's a great place to start because there's so much data, and it's so people wear it on the cuff of their shirt. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can learn, from sport, and that trickles out into the other parts of the world, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that's one of my intentions is with doing the research. We've been lucky enough to have many different studies. There's now a few books that students can read and interested parties can read, that the whole purpose is to try and teach people about these differences. And I once read a book, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was about, part of the title was Red and Blue. And it was about politics in the United States. And kind of the premise of it was, if you can at least try to understand why someone feels a certain way, or the things that they believe and how that shapes their beliefs and maybe their political views, doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them. But if you have better understanding, it's that extended contact hypothesis where you can coexist with that person and you're not going to be as negative toward that person. And I think especially now, that's more important than ever. And so that over the last 5 or 6 years, I've really started a concerted attempt to find the positive aspects of these. So, where, and some of the stuff we've done, like with the theme parks comparison to sport and the comics comparison to sport, we found something pretty cool, that people who say they are fans of two different things, so a fan of sport and a fan of the Disney theme parks, or a fan of sport and a fan of the comic book genre, they are less negative toward their outgroup in both of those settings, in sport and theme parks, in sport and comics, than someone who just identifies as either a sport fan or a comic fan or a sport fan and a theme park fan. Because you have more interests. When a person only has one interest and one group that they can identify with, when that group experiences some type of failure, they don't have anywhere else to turn to find that kind of feel good, that perceived success. So they have the potential to become more negative toward the out group, and to protect the in group.
Yeah, and those groups are probably not, made up of the exact same people. So they're getting like you're saying, they're getting some interaction. It's almost a more well-rounded interaction with different types of people.
Yeah, and that's another great point, that we've talked about, if you have two groups that are negative toward each other, and let's say you have an Alabama fan and an Auburn fan, but they both like comics. Well, there's their shared group. Or they both like Disney theme parks. There's their shared groups. That's a way to, in some ways, decrease that negativity. Because, and if it means that an Alabama fan and an Auburn fan, they never talk about sports, they're only talking about DC or Marvel, or they're only talking about Disney, or they're only talking about gaming or whatever it is, you find those commonalities and you find and what people agree on. That's an overall positive thing, because especially right now, you can't put someone in one box and keep them in that box, because someone that you may disagree with on one issue, maybe they have a strong, like maybe you agree with them on something else.
Yeah.
Or you're a fan of something that they're a fan of. And that's at least kind of that commonality that helps people, again, going back to that book that I read, that helps people to see that they can coexist and maybe have a positive relationship with this person, even if they don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need right now.
Yeah. You can talk to somebody and, immediately start arguing about politics. But if you switch the conversation to, Auburn football, you could be friends for the next 8 hours and not even think about it. You know?
Yeah. And
that's an important thing.
One thing that I'll say is I've been, I've mentioned throughout, but I mentioned being a huge fan of Disney. And so like I've done a few projects around that because a lot of times you kind of study what you're interested in, what your personal interests are, and you ask questions and you try to find these questions. And that's my philosophy, is that this should be fun. People should have a good time doing this. So we've written papers about like trying to have a good time doing it, trying to use creativity and imagination in the research process. We've even written a paper of how to use the Marvel Cinematic Universe as like this guideline to the research process. But I'm a member of like several different groups on social media about like the Disney parks and the company, and about comics and things. And in those groups, especially in the Disney groups, I see so much positivity, because there's so much positivity around that brand that people like. It brings out kind of happy emotions, positive emotions. And, people don't talk about it in those groups, that they don't talk about the things they don't agree on. They're focusing on things that they do agree on. And, that in some way does help, or could help move people forward toward a better understanding of each other. Because, let's say two fans of Disney then realize they're on different ends of the spectrum on different teams or different beliefs or whatever. And maybe they start to view that person differently. Then they can also say, well, but we're both still really big fans of this aspect of this brand. And so there's at least a positive connection that we have.
Yeah, it's funny, something like these schools, that have these big brands. I wonder if, you have a group of Texas football fans, if it's as positive as a Disney group or something like that. Even though there may be that same, love of the brand, one brand has this positive ethos, and one, might, I don't know, draw people. I feel like sometimes politics is that way. There's people can be really, really into it, but they're kind of into it in a sometimes in a negative way. But
yeah. And when we've compared so far, we've found that fans in sport the negativity, they report stronger negativity than in other brands, with the exception of, like I said, the two aspects in politics where where political supporters reported stronger negative feelings than in sport. So it is, like sport is up there as far as the negativity that can come from sport. And what's important for practitioners is, and if you have people listening that they work for organizations or they work for community centers, sport, everyone talks about, or everyone who works in sport always loves talking about the positive aspects, the positive characteristics that can come from sport, teamwork and dealing with adversity and all of these things. And there are a lot of positives that can come from it. And one I would put up at the top of the list is sport the ability of sport to have a voice, your athletes to have a voice. Like we're seeing a lot of athletes now, we're seeing leagues have voices now, and those really do bring on, some type of change. They bring on social change in various settings or various situations. And so that's all very important. And there are positive aspects of it. We also have to be willing to, if we like something, we have to be willing to take a critical eye at it too, a critical look at and say, here are some of the negative things that can come from it. And how can we kind of steer people more toward these positive characteristics than these negative characteristics? Because you had opened talking about, being young and impressionable and seeing something negative. And what you were referring to, I was writing about taking a kid to a game and seeing a fight break out and that kid never wanting to go back or never wanting to consume sport, and how to an organization that ultimately could mean that kid, they've lost that kid for the rest of their lives. They're not going to be a consumer. A personal example is when I was in the 8th grade, I believe, I always kind of leaned toward the University of Texas over Texas A&M, but they're both huge brands in the state. And I went to a Texas A&M game in College Station where one of my cousins was in school. And so we're at that game, and Texas ended up winning that game. And some Texas students tried to rush the field, and a fight broke out with the Texas students and the Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M. And I remember seeing that and just saying, like, I don't want to be a part of this. This is very uncomfortable for me. And, what I was seeing, and obviously, like, if an A&M fan's listening, they're probably saying, well, Texas fans were trying to rush the field. Like, they had a part of it as well. And that's very, very true. What I was seeing in my 8th grade self was that these people were rushing the field, and there were people who were, teaming up on people rushing the field, and it was getting very, very negative. And that was kind of a point where I was like, I think I know where I'm going to go, or I think I at least know where I'm not going to go. And so there is some personal experience with that as well.
Yeah. So it had real effect on you, and
yeah,
real outcome where you went to a different school because of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And, I know you got to go here pretty soon, so I really appreciate the time, and, you're welcome back anytime. And, anything else you want to mention or plug before we go here?
I think I would just, if people want more information on what Rivalry is, go to sportrivalry.com. I have students every fall in my marketing classes who do a podcast called This Week in Rivalry, play on This Week in Baseball. That was popular when I was growing up. They do This Week in Rivalry, which they feature kind of upcoming games. And if you think about the last 5 minutes of College game day, that's they're giving their predictions and things like that. That's what these podcasts are. And all that's available on sportrivalry.com. It's also available on my YouTube channel, which I think if you're on YouTube and you search Cody T. Havard, PhD, because I post things on there about research as well, but you can see all of that stuff. Through both of those, you can see the comics on the sportrivalry.com. You can see the videos on there or on YouTube. And I talk about some of the research that we've done and have different commentaries. And you can also follow me, I think, on Twitter. I'm C Havard PhD is the handle. That's where I send out the most stuff. And I would say that for people who are interested, please interact, please engage, please reach out. The overall goal of all of this and what I've been doing for, since 2009 and what I will continue to do is try to have a better understanding of who we are and try to find kind of a positive balance between how do we stay engaged and how do we get people to have fun without kind of going over to that negative side and being deviant or violent with each other, because that is really where things can be hurt. So I love rivalries. I love rivalries as much as anyone else. And I want to find a way that they can be fun for everyone, and not go overly negative, which is on the YouTube channel as well. I had a student a few years ago do a documentary about rivalry and about that particular aspect of it, which can be found on the channel as well. A Closer Look at Sport Rivalry is the name of that one. If anybody wants to watch that, by Nathan Galloway. He did an extremely good job. Okay. So that's it. Thank you very much for having me. This was
of course.
Blast.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. So that was an episode with Dr. Cody Havard. Hope you really enjoyed that. We really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation. We'll probably have him back on again in the future. And, as he mentioned, go hit up, sportrivalry.com and see some of the things there. I think it all kind of stems from that area. And then from our end, go to ArtGibbs. We're going to post this on the ArtGibbs podcast page on YouTube. Also go to the ArtGibbs page on YouTube, where we have a lot of financial videos. We do really quick, short videos, 10 minutes or less, really, where we talk about all things finance. We like to get into interesting topics there. It's not necessarily sports related, although a lot of those same instruments and things are used in mergers and acquisitions in sports, just as they would be in anything else. So I encourage you to go check that out. Please like and subscribe. We're in the early stages. Any little bit helps, and 5-star review would be fantastic. You can leave some comments. We love the interaction. As Cody mentioned in the interview, it's necessary in the study of a lot of things. It's necessary in research. It's necessary in getting topics. And so any questions, thoughts, topics you want to see looked at, please, don't hesitate to reach out. We appreciate that. Again, thank you, and we'll see you next time.